In the case of Volin, we cannot ignore the story about the sons of one of the pastors of the Evangelical Faith Pentecostal Church. If anyone should be a role model, it's the pastor's children, a standard of exemplary behavior and a guide for those who have strayed. Well, dear friends, it turned out that it could be anyone, but not them. I mean, not these particular ones. The Sydorchuk family is well known in Bronitsia village, located in Kamin-Kashirsky district, Volyn. Its head, Mr. Alexander Sydorchuk, has been the pastor of the Evangelical Pentecostal Church for several years now. He is married with children and respected by local authorities. I couldn't find open source information on how Alexander Sydorchuk became a pastor or why he chose this church over others. Maybe some of you know something or have heard something, please write it in the comments. But actually, it's not that important in the context of this particular case. After all, it's not so much about him as it is about his sons, Ruvim, Anton, and Yuri. In one of the local media outlets, I found the following description of these individuals.
Ruvim and Anton Sydorchuk, the children of a village clergyman, barely finished school and dodged the army because of their supposed religious beliefs, which forbid them from taking up arms. They should have, as Christianity preaches, worked honestly before people and before God. However, the boys, backed by dollar support from their relatives, cousins who are so-called religious refugees that emigrated to the United States, whose father, Dmitro Sydorchuk, is a deputy in the Evangelical Church, decided, following the best rules of Hollywood movies, to become godfathers, choosing to live by the rules of the local criminal underworld.
If you trust what's online, the brothers went into business together. However, this business was far from legal. Their first startup was smuggling cigarettes and alcohol to Poland. The business failed, and the brothers were caught and reportedly deported. The case was hushed up thanks to the family's money and their connections in the prosecutor's office. Probably realizing that working abroad was too risky, the brothers focused on business inside the country, even more locally within their own neighborhood, where everything was familiar. Let's not jump to conclusions yet, dear ones, since there are no final court decisions.
But I'll quote what is written in online media. It's easier to beat the father together. That's what the children of Pastor Alexander Sydorchuk thought, and after gathering an organized criminal group around themselves, they began attacking the residents of Kiev. Replace it with Kashirska and the surrounding villages. After all, when you have green currency in your pocket, the police and the law are no longer any obstacle, and...
Now let's get more specific for clarity. The history of these conflicts, not only with the locals but also with the police, which is well known, begins in 2018, although I dare say that things weren't all smooth even before that. Back then, the pastor's sons and some friends saw themselves as the golden youth and began racing cars, with foreign registration and imported plates. They organized real races and showed off with stunts. Of course, the residents didn't like this situation at all. They repeatedly complained to the police that guys from several villages were systematically showing off their extreme driving skills to passers-by. Well, that's just the official version. There was no reaction to it. There wasn't for a long time. You can guess why yourself. But eventually, in March 2018, in the middle of the night, one of the so-called Schumachers lost control of an Audi A6 and crashed into an electric pole. This drunk stunt driver was reckless, so patrol officers finally arrived, facing a tough call. You see, when the law enforcement officers started processing the accident, both the culprit and his friends, that is the pastor's sons, began to resist. They pulled the police officers by their uniforms, pushed them, blocked their movement, and on their own, using another car, towed away the Audi that was damaged in the accident. They weren't able to seize the car at that time, but the story didn't end there. On June 4th, masked, camouflaged armed officers seized 3 cars with European plates. That Audi was among them too. So it turned out that the cars were brought in violating customs regulations and had overstayed their permitted period in Ukraine. Whether anyone was imprisoned or punished, in the end nothing happened. And that's not all. Apparently one of the businesses the brothers were involved in back home was illegal sand mining. It's a profitable business, especially if you don't have to worry about any permits. The newly minted businessmen seemed confident that no one would stand in their way. That's why they didn't bother to hide anything. But in August 2020, in the village of Bronitsia, patrol officers noticed a tractor with a trailer that was moving strangely. The person driving it was blatantly violating traffic rules. The police stopped the reckless driver. Sensing he'd be blamed for everything, he ran away, but later returned. However, this time he brought reinforcements. Aggressive young men started gathering at the scene. The Sydorchuk brothers also started resisting the police. At that time, the gang was led by Ruvim and Anton. According to locals, their support was provided by their uncle, Leonid Shakno. He allegedly spent years illegally extracting and selling both construction sand and valuable sand deposits. He knew the situation. After the argument, a scuffle broke out. Then the Sydorchuks started grabbing at the police uniforms, and eventually, it all turned into a real fight. The young men beat up the police officer, and not just a little. He was later diagnosed with hematomas, bruises on his face, legs, and body overall. Eventually, the offenders pushed the law enforcement officers back and took their tractor. Special Unit KORD fighters arrived at the scene. Only then was the situation brought under control. As a result, 3 of the most active offenders were taken to the police station, including 18-year-old Yuri Sydorchuk, one of the brothers. But that's not all. The Sydorchuks were also involved in more than just conflicts and fights with law enforcement. I didn't mention at the beginning for nothing that they were terrorizing the locals. Ms. Halina Fetchik has lived in Bronitsia village for decades. The old lady saw with her own eyes what the Sydorchuks were doing. She knew they were dangerous. She and her relatives were hostile and chose to stand up to them. So, after finding out exactly where the Sydorchuks were allegedly illegally digging a quarry from which they were stealing sand and peat, they, the villagers, called the police. And after that, the pastor's sons turned the family's life into hell. One of the brothers even threatened to bury people alive.
Sydorchuk Rovim called my phone. And he said, you get on your knees and ask for forgiveness. From Uncle and us for calling the police. Then from the officers for calling them. And then we take you to the quarry and bury you alive.
The threatening call was only the start. Then the fence around the woman's house was covered with, let's say, obscene drawings. Apparently, they decided this was just child's play, so they brought in, so to speak, the heavy artillery. An explosive was thrown into Halina Fetchik's yard and detonated, but she was unharmed. But the criminals kept going. Later, they even shot at the old woman's house. It reached a point where the police had to be stationed there because it became that dangerous for her. Here's another incident. Yuri Sydorchuk, reportedly drunk, beat a resident of Sochechny. First, the victim was sprayed with tear gas, then brutally beaten. Thus, KORD special unit officers again arrived in Bronitsa. But this time, the Sydorchuk family was searched. And surprisingly, they found more than just the Holy Scriptures. Law enforcement officers also seized weapons and live ammunition. It would seem that the police have more than enough evidence of the Sydorchuk family's illegal activities. So why aren't they behind bars yet? After all, even the national police confirmed that criminal proceedings have been opened.
Criminal proceedings have been opened against these individuals since 2018 and also in 2023. More than 8 lawsuits were filed in court for violations of certain articles of the Criminal Code. Mostly, it's Article 342, obstruction of police officers.
But opening a criminal case does not necessarily mean detaining the suspects, and the suspects, are currently on the international wanted list. According to information from the automated forecasting system at the state border, Ruvim Sydorchuk allegedly left for Poland on February 23, 2022, that is, a day before the full-scale invasion, and has not returned to Ukraine since. And if we believe Interpol's data, Ruvim is currently living peacefully in Germany. However, the lawyer, who unlike his client attends court hearings, denies the information that Ruvim is hiding from punishment abroad. He says the defendant can't return to Ukraine due to the war. That's it. Instead, Yuri Sydorchuk fled abroad on April 25, 2023. He stated that he lives in Germany during a live broadcast at the court hearing. If his guilt is proven, he must be punished for causing minor bodily injuries, as well as for threats and obstructing the work of law enforcement officers. Yuri, like Ruvim, is now internationally wanted. A third brother, Anton Sydorchuk, was found guilty of group hooliganism in the summer of 2021, but he was not punished because the statute of limitations had expired by the time the verdict was delivered. However, the defendant paid the victim 10,000 hryvnias for moral damages. The prosecutors tried to appeal the verdict of the Kamień-Kaszyrsky District Court, but the appellate and cassation courts upheld it. So it turns out to be a rather strange situation. On the one hand, relatively peaceful days have come for the residents, since 2 of the 3 brothers fled abroad. But on the other hand, it's unknown whether justice will ever catch up with them at all. Thank you. The next story from Volin seems quite simple and clear at first glance, but that's only at first. After all, there's definitely something in it that adds a lot of mystery. A family lived in a house on Brestska Street in Kovel. A mother, a father, and their 15-year-old daughter. October 3rd, 2019 was an ordinary day for them. The adults were dealing with their work matters, and the teenager was studying her lessons. Around 10 p.m., as everyone was preparing for bed, a commotion came from the summer kitchen. The family ran out at the loud noise to check what had happened. What they saw was shocking. Standing in front of them was their neighbor, a 14-year-old boy. It was the perfect moment to ask what had happened and how he ended up on their private property in the summer kitchen. But it was not the time for conversation. Looking closer, the adults saw that the teenager was holding knives in his hands. And in a split second, the boy lunged at the neighbors. In fact, with those knives. The teenager stabbed the woman right in the heart. She immediately fell dead in her own yard. The man received several stabs to the chest and abdomen. However, he remained conscious. And perhaps that's the only thing that saved his daughter's life. After all, when the young attacker ran after the girl, he managed to stab her a couple of times. However, he didn't finish the job. Fortunately, the girl's father jumped in just in time, knocked the knife out of his hand with his last bit of strength, and drove the attacker away. While the victims called an ambulance and the police, the guy ran away. No one knows where. He threw away the weapon nearby. He hid himself for a short time. The police and medics arrived almost at the same time. Unfortunately, they couldn't save the woman. All they could do was confirm her death.
Our dispatchers in Lutsk received a call about a stabbing. A medical team was dispatched. At the scene, there was a woman born in 1978 with no signs of life, with a penetrating wound to the chest in the heart area.
The man was immediately taken from the scene to the operating table and then transferred to the intensive care unit. The extent to which the attacker cut him was shocking, especially since it was a teenager. How did he get enough strength and agility to overpower an adult man? Agility, fine.
Around 11 p.m., a 44-year-old patient was admitted to the surgical department with severe injuries, multiple wounds to the chest and the anterior abdominal wall. The patient is currently in the intensive care unit. His condition is stable but serious.
The girl was also hospitalized. Fortunately, her injuries were not life-threatening. However, her emotional state was extremely difficult. Interestingly, it didn't take long to find the attacker. The boy came to the scene himself. However, he wasn't planning to surrender. The young man likely tried to mislead the investigation. When he stepped into the yard where the tragedy happened, he tried to show all his acting skills to the fullest, as if he didn't know anything, hadn't heard anything. He asked like, what a horror, what happened here? I don't know. Tell me. Of course, he couldn't play this game for long. The daughter of the family he attacked was a witness, and she told everything to the police. The girl knew the guy very well. They studied at different schools, but since they lived nearby, they would meet. Moreover, a few hours before the attack, the teenager came to the girl's house and asked for an atlas to study. She said she would share it, but a little later, when she finished her own homework. But later, the boy was no longer interested in the atlas. The police detained him quite quickly, you could say, hot on the trail. But despite the fact that the victim saw him, and despite the fact that the murder weapon was found nearby, the teenager refused to admit his guilt. Like, it wasn't me, and that's it, period. As they say, just playing dumb. What exactly happened to the boy and why he decided to cold-bloodedly kill his neighbors was, and still is, the biggest mystery up to this point. Everyone spoke well of the young man. At school they said he was sociable, smart, and never had any problems with discipline.
A cheerful guy. He joked a lot. He never broke discipline in class.
Calm. Moreover, the neighbors who knew both the teenager himself and his family said the same thing.
This guy was calm. By the way, he even used to come over to hang out with my sister. So for 14 years, I didn't even know that he could even do that.
By the way, they specifically emphasize the family he grew up in. Decent, respectable people who never had conflicts with anyone.
The family is very good, calm. For as long as they've lived here, we've never seen any fights or anything like that. The children were always home like any others. Now they're gone. Good people, good neighbors.
Interestingly, the teenager had quite a variety of interests. On one hand, he loved programming. The homeroom teacher from school said that it was literally his passion, his element. In other words, it was something where he could show himself at his best. The teenager was generally an average student, but in this particular field, he could really show his strongest sides. He loved computer games and often went to church. He served there.
I don't know what happened to him. Did he serve in the church too?
No.
He's good at home. So their child, such a little girl. And another older boy? Yes, and the children? No. They work on the railroad.
Despite praising the boy's positive qualities, the neighbors were the ones who hinted. He was probably using psychotropic substances, but there was no evidence of this, neither during the investigation nor after it was completed. At least I didn't find any such mentions in open sources. However, assumptions, even such serious ones from people, can be understood. Imagine a local teenager suddenly deciding to kill an entire family. Why? The perpetrator's parents did not give any comments to journalists. In fact, they almost instantly disappeared from the radar. Literally a couple of days after the tragedy, they packed up all their things and left the house. Nevertheless, when the investigation began, the mother asked for her son, the killer, to be released home. The woman assured that she would be able to provide proper care for him, as well as ensure her son's proper procedural behavior while under house arrest. The request is quite interesting, especially considering how the teenager behaved after what he did. Let me remind you, he ran away. The boy was also provided with a lawyer. This caused considerable concern among some residents of Kovel. First of all, the lawyer for the minor, who is also the murderer, was a former police investigator whose son, at the time of the case review, worked as a senior investigator at the Kovel police department, where this high-profile crime was being investigated. In addition, local media reported that the defender, Serhiy Momot, became notorious in the city 20 years ago for, let's say, getting the perpetrator of a fatal accident on Central Street off the hook, an accident in which a young child died. But in the end, all the fears turned out to be unfounded. In May 2022, the court finally delivered a verdict to the teenager. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison for what he had done. But for most people, probably except for the perpetrator himself, it still remains a mystery why he decided to kill his neighbors. Donechka. It's interesting that retribution for certain actions can find the guilty at any age. Not always, but sometimes. The previous story's killer paid for his actions immediately, still as a teenager. But the volleyball coach I'm going to talk about next almost lived his whole life to the end. Is that really punishment? Probably it won't catch up with him, but that's not certain yet. Bohuslav Halitsky is a well-known name in Volyn, especially among sports enthusiasts. If you are a volleyball fan, used to play volleyball, personally attended the children's and youth sports school in Lutsk, or took your child there, then the surname Halitsky must have definitely stuck in your memory. Actually, just like his face, and not without reason. You see, this gray-haired man is an honored coach of Ukraine since 1988. He also earned the title of Honored Worker of Physical Culture and Sports in 1997. For more than 25 years, he headed the aforementioned sports school and was a volleyball coach. In particular, he took care of the women's volleyball team at Volyn University. I am unsure if further career development is possible here, especially given Halitsky's age. And he's over 70. He probably wouldn't leave his position in the coming years, if it weren't for one little but very hairy. But in 2022, the Volyn media were up in arms. A well-known volleyball coach was accused of sexual harassment and sexual violence. 5 trainees filed a report with the police. I think you can guess whose name appeared in the news. Yes, it was none other than Bohuslav Halitsky. At 72 years old, he was put in handcuffs. And it was at 72 that he heard he might soon end up behind bars. So what exactly happened? According to the investigation, Halitsky regularly committed lewd acts against the female students of the school for almost 10 years. He used his own influence and authority, humiliating and intimidating the girls. Well, he also forced them to undress and do, let's say, indecent things. The most terrible thing is that it seems all the girls were still underage when this happened to them. It's awful at any age, but when it's kids, that's really messed up. The investigation conducted by law enforcement indicates that Halitsky could end up in prison on charges under 3 articles of the Criminal Code, namely forcible satisfaction of sexual desire in an unnatural way, corruption of minors, and also rape of minors. When law enforcement came to search the school where Halitsky worked and thoroughly checked what the coach kept in his office, the level of surprise was beyond words. In the elderly coach's office, officers found dozens of sex toys. Blurred photos showed at least dildos and vibrators of various sizes and colors. Of course, these could have been Halitsky's personal belongings, and no one has the right to judge him. Maybe he just likes doing that for himself, and that's fine if that's what someone enjoys. But the problem was that he was harassing girls, including at his workplace, that is, directly at the sports school. So it's unlikely that the sex toys ended up there by accident. The police confirmed this to us as well.
He committed lewd acts of a sexual nature against the will of minors in the premises of the training facility in Lutsk. During the authorized search, investigators seized items in his office that indicate these actions. All items have been seized for examination.
At first, Halitsky was detained and held for 60 days. However, soon the preventive measure was changed. The coach was placed under house arrest. There was no official statement about why this happened. However, journalists learned from their own sources that Halitsky allegedly had a stroke. Due to his health, the court changed the preventive measure and the suspect was to be under medical supervision.
The prosecutors filed a motion to extend the preventive measure in the form of detention. However, the court changed the preventive measure for the accused to round-the-clock house arrest. The prosecutors will do everything to ensure that the accused receives a fair punishment.
Bohuslav Halitsky has not commented on the situation and still remains silent. Journalists were banned from filming at the sports school. They stated that they are aware of the incident but will not comment on anything. Bohuslav Halitsky's students also declined to comment but confirmed the harassment.
I'm ready to tell you, but I don't know if we'll be able to meet. If that's okay with you, I can confirm this information here, over the phone.
How the story will end is still unknown. The final decision will be made by the court, and the case apparently is still ongoing. At least for now, there are still no mentions of a verdict for Halitsky in open sources. The former renowned coach could face up to 12 years in prison. This case is worth following closely. Dear friends, thank you for watching the video all the way to the very end. Unfortunately, there is no way to record this farewell on camera, so that's why it's like this. I hope everything is good with you, and with me as well. See you.